Hey guys, tonight we journey back to an America where winter was not simply a season, but a relentless test of endurance. Long before central heating, electric blankets, insulated jackets, and weather forecasts appeared on glowing screens, ordinary families faced months of cold that seemed almost alive. Every icy wind carried uncertainty. Every snowfall threatened hunger. Every sunset arrived with the question of whether the fire would last until morning. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy these sleepy journeys through history. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable. Perhaps let a blanket settle over your shoulders, and together, let us wander into the frozen landscapes of early America. Imagine that it is the middle of January, somewhere in the late 17th century. Dawn has not yet broken, although calling it dawn hardly feels appropriate. The sky remains the color of cold iron, and the pale light creeping across the horizon does little more than reveal another endless blanket of snow. You open your eyes not because you feel rested, but because the cold has found its way beneath every layer of wool and linen you possess. During the night, frost has quietly decorated the inside of your window. Tiny crystals spread across the glass in delicate patterns, as if nature has painted flowers using nothing but ice. The fire that burned proudly the evening before has nearly surrendered. A few glowing embers hide beneath gray ash, offering only a faint reminder of warmth. There is no thermostat waiting for a simple adjustment. There is no switch to brighten the room or warm the floor beneath your feet. Instead, your day begins with the ancient ritual of convincing a dying fire that it should continue living. You pull yourself from beneath heavy blankets stuffed with feathers gathered over many seasons. The air bites immediately. Every breath feels sharp enough to remind you that comfort is an invention belonging to distant centuries. The wooden floor is so cold that it almost burns your bare feet. Somewhere nearby, another member of the household coughs, quietly, the sound echoing through the small cabin before disappearing into thick timber walls. Outside, the wind has already begun its endless conversation with the trees. The cabin itself seems sturdy enough from a distance. Thick logs stacked carefully together create walls meant to protect against the elements. Yet winter possesses remarkable patience. Tiny gaps between the logs invite thin streams of icy air inside. Moss, clay, and handmade chinking help seal the cracks, but they are never perfect. Throughout the night, invisible fingers of cold wander across every room. Early American settlers quickly discovered that building a home was only the beginning. Keeping it warm demanded constant effort. A fire required wood. Wood required labor. Labor required strength. Strength required food. Every necessity depended upon another, creating a chain that could break at any point during the long season. Before breakfast, someone must step outdoors. The heavy wooden door groans as it opens. Instantly, the cold surrounds you like an ocean. Snow reaches nearly to your knees, forcing each step into deliberate effort. The silence is astonishing. Fresh snow absorbs sound so completely that even the forest appears to whisper instead of speak. Your destination is the woodpile. Months earlier, during warm summer afternoons and colorful autumn evenings, countless hours were spent felling trees, chopping logs, splitting kindling, and stacking everything beneath simple shelters. Winter rewards or punishes that preparation. Every piece of firewood represents a small promise made to your future self. If enough wood was gathered, perhaps the family survives comfortably. If not, the outcome becomes far less certain. Each log feels heavier than expected. Cold hardens muscles. Thick gloves, if you are fortunate enough to own them, reduce dexterity. Snow slips inside boots that were never truly waterproof. Still, the wood must be carried indoors because warmth waits for no one. Back inside, sparks gradually awaken beneath careful hands. Dry shavings catch first, followed by thin branches, then thicker pieces. Slowly, orange light returns to the room. Smoke curls upward toward the chimney, though not all of it escapes. Early fireplaces often struggled to draw smoke efficiently. Depending on wind direction, the room might briefly fill with enough smoke to sting eyes and throats before finally clearing. Breakfast remains modest. Perhaps coarse cornmeal cooked into a thick porridge. Perhaps yesterday's bread warmed near the fire. If the household is fortunate, there may be smoked pork or salted beef stored from autumn slaughtering. Fresh vegetables have largely disappeared. Potatoes, turnips, onions, and carrots survive longest inside root cellars, but supplies steadily shrink as winter stretches onward. Every meal quietly reminds the family how many weeks remain before spring. Modern grocery stores encourage abundance. Early American winters encouraged calculation. How much flour remains? How many barrels of salted meat? How many dried beans? How many apples survived storage without rotting? Every answer matters. Food preservation occupied enormous portions of colonial life because nature offered little during the coldest months. Smoking, salting, drying, pickling, fermenting, these were not culinary hobbies. They were survival strategies refined through generations of experience. Even something as ordinary as butter became unpredictable. Milk production declined sharply during winter because cows produced less while feeding on stored hay rather than lush summer pasture. Chickens laid fewer eggs beneath shortened daylight. Fresh food slowly transformed into memory. After breakfast, work begins almost immediately. Winter did not eliminate labor. It merely changed its nature. Tools needed repair. Clothing required mending. Rope had to be twisted. Candles demanded constant production because darkness arrived early each afternoon. Animal feed required carrying through snow. Livestock depended entirely upon human diligence until grass returned months later. Inside many homes, spinning wheels hummed steadily. Women transformed raw wool into thread before weaving cloth strong enough to become blankets, shirts, stockings, or coats. Every garment represented hundreds of hours of invisible labor. Clothing was precious because replacing it required remarkable effort. Children learned these realities quickly. There was little opportunity for idleness. Even the youngest family members gathered kindling, fetched water when streams remained accessible, cared for smaller animals, or assisted with simple household tasks. Childhood certainly included games and laughter, but survival allowed little separation between children and adult responsibility. Education, where available, often paused whenever weather became especially severe. Travel itself posed extraordinary difficulty. Roads vanished beneath drifting snow, bridges iced over, frozen rivers occasionally served as temporary highways. Although trusting thick ice always involved careful judgment. One unusually warm afternoon could weaken crossings that appeared perfectly solid only a day earlier. Letters arrived slowly. Sometimes they failed to arrive at all. Entire communities accepted long periods without news from neighboring settlements. Distance expanded during winter. A journey requiring 6 hours during autumn might demand 2 exhausting days after heavy snowfall. For isolated farms, this reality carried profound emotional consequences. Imagine becoming ill, not merely catching a small cold, but suffering a broken leg, severe infection, or dangerous fever. A doctor might live 20 or 30 miles away. Snowstorms could make reaching help almost impossible. Medical knowledge itself remained limited by modern standards. Yet, even experienced physicians often struggled simply to arrive before illness had run its course. Many births occurred during winter. Midwives traveled through darkness, carrying simple bags containing generations of practical knowledge rather than sophisticated instruments. Families waited anxiously for footsteps outside because every delay increased uncertainty. Life continued despite the cold. Children were born. People married. Neighbors celebrated holidays. Prayers filled tiny meeting houses. Human hope refused to freeze, even when nearly everything else did. The landscape itself seemed transformed into another world. Forests familiar during summer became endless cathedrals of bare branches. Animal tracks crossed fresh snow like handwritten messages. White-tailed deer searched patiently for exposed vegetation beneath drifts. Foxes moved silently through frozen fields. Ravens watched from dark treetops, their calls carrying remarkable distances across crisp winter air. For Native American communities who had lived across these lands for countless generations before European settlement, winter presented immense challenges as well. Yet their knowledge of seasonal movement, hunting patterns, clothing construction, food storage, and environmental observation often reflected centuries of careful adaptation. Many European newcomers survived only after learning practical skills from indigenous neighbors whose understanding of local winters far exceeded anything the settlers had previously known. Still, knowledge could not erase hardship. A particularly severe winter remained dangerous for everyone. Colonial records occasionally describe livestock freezing despite shelter, stored food spoiled unexpectedly, snow-buried fences, until wandering animals disappeared into forests. Wolves, driven by hunger, sometimes ventured closer to settlements than anyone preferred. At night, unusual sounds outside the cabin invited anxious imagination. Was it merely wind pressing against loose shutters, a fox searching for scraps, a hungry bear disturbed from winter sleep, or perhaps nothing more than branches rubbing together beneath accumulating ice? Darkness encouraged uncertainty. Without electric lights, the night belonged largely to firelight and moonlight. Shadows danced constantly across rough wooden walls. Every flickering flame transformed familiar objects into strange silhouettes. Candles were valuable, so families often conserved them carefully. Once the evening meal ended, conversation, quiet reading for those fortunate enough to own books, sewing, or simple storytelling filled the remaining hours before sleep. Stories carried unusual importance. They entertained, they educated, they preserved family memory. Around countless fireplaces, grandparents described distant homelands across the Atlantic. Hunters recalled remarkable encounters in frozen forests. Ministers reflected upon faith during difficult seasons. Children listened closely, absorbing lessons that no written book could fully replace. Outside, winter continued its patient work. Snow drifted against doors. Ice thickened along rivers. Stars emerged with astonishing clarity above forests, untouched by artificial light. The temperature fell steadily. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly, pushing back against the immense cold gathering just beyond the walls. For now, the family remained warm enough. For now, the roof still held. For now, the woodpile appeared sufficient. But January had only just begun, and somewhere beyond the silent hills, another storm was already beginning to gather. The first sign rarely came with drama. There was no trumpet from the heavens, no distant roar rolling across the hills, no obvious warning that demanded immediate action. Instead, winter preferred quieter announcements. The wind shifted ever so slightly during the night. The morning air carried an unusual heaviness. Birds that normally fluttered through nearby branches seemed strangely absent. Even the family dog, usually eager to wander the yard, hesitated before stepping into the snow. People who spent their lives close to the land noticed these things almost without thinking. Weather was not something they checked on paper or heard from a cheerful voice over the radio. It was something they watched in the shape of clouds, the smell of the air, the direction of smoke rising from the chimney, and the behavior of animals that often sensed change before any human could. By mid-morning, the western sky had become an endless sheet of dull gray. The sunlight, weak as it already was during January, slowly disappeared behind thickening clouds. Shadows softened until the landscape seemed painted with only two colors, white snow below and pale gray sky above. The horizon faded almost completely, leaving forest and heaven blended into one quiet blur. No one spoke much during chores. There was simply more work to finish before the storm arrived. Extra logs were carried inside. Buckets were filled with water before wells became difficult to reach. The livestock received larger portions of hay than usual. Chickens were encouraged into their coops early, while the family carefully checked every latch and wooden hinge. A loose door on a calm day might become a dangerous problem after nightfall if freezing winds forced it open. Even simple tasks took longer than expected. Leather straps stiffened in the cold. Metal tools clung painfully to bare fingers. Every knot required more effort because hands quickly lost feeling despite thick woolen mittens. The pace of life during winter was not fast. It could not be. The season itself demanded patience. Imagine trying to split firewood while wearing several layers of heavy clothing. Each swing of the axe required careful balance upon packed snow. A single careless step might send the blade glancing sideways instead of into the log. An injury during winter could transform an ordinary afternoon into weeks of hardship. Hospitals, of course, did not exist as most people understand them today. A deep cut from an axe, a broken wrist after slipping on ice, a crushed foot beneath a falling log. These were not simply painful accidents. They threatened the survival of an entire household. If the strongest worker became unable to gather wood or care for livestock, everyone shared the consequences. Communities understood this better than anyone. Neighbors often depended upon one another in ways that modern life rarely requires. If one family lost their barn during a storm, nearby settlers gathered to rebuild it. If illness spread through a household, others sometimes brought food, chopped wood, or cared for animals until recovery came. This spirit of cooperation was not merely kindness. It was practical wisdom. Anyone helping today might need similar help before spring arrived. By early afternoon, snowflakes finally appeared. At first, they floated gently, almost lazily, drifting through the air with surprising elegance. Children, if they had finished their chores, occasionally paused to watch the first flakes land upon mittens or coat sleeves. Fresh snow always carried a certain beauty, even for those who knew the difficulties it would soon create. Within an hour, however, the snowfall grew heavier. The forest across the clearing slowly disappeared. Fence posts became little more than dark shapes. The path leading toward the nearest neighbor vanished beneath fresh powder, as though it had never existed at all. Inside the cabin, preparations continued. The fire burned brighter than usual. Iron pots hung above glowing coals, while simple stews simmered slowly throughout the afternoon. Long cooking times made sense during winter because the fire remained necessary regardless. Every bit of heat served more than one purpose. It warmed the room, prepared meals, dried damp clothing, and occasionally heated stones that could later be wrapped in cloth and placed beneath blankets before bedtime. Nothing was wasted. Ashes from yesterday's fire might help make soap. Animal fat became candles. Old fabric transformed into quilts. Broken wooden tools supplied kindling. Colonial households developed remarkable habits of conservation because replacing everyday items demanded tremendous effort. A cracked bowl might continue serving for years. A worn pair of boots would receive patch after patch before anyone considered making another. Even nails represented valuable possessions. If an old building was dismantled, people carefully removed every usable nail by hand. Iron required skilled blacksmiths, considerable labor, and expensive materials. Throwing away metal simply because it looked old would have seemed almost unbelievable. As snow accumulated outside, conversation naturally turned toward earlier winters. Nearly every older person possessed stories that younger generations listened to with wide eyes. One man remembered a snowfall so deep that cabin doors could not be opened until tunnels were dug through packed drifts. Another recalled rivers freezing thick enough for loaded wagons to cross safely. Someone else described wolves following travelers for miles without making a sound. Whether every detail remained perfectly accurate hardly mattered. Stories became part memory, part warning, and part entertainment. Winter evenings encouraged reflection. Perhaps that is because darkness arrived so early. By what modern people would consider late afternoon, the fading light already hinted at night. Work outdoors became increasingly difficult. Shadows stretched across snowy fields until everything gradually disappeared beneath twilight. Candles flickered to life one by one. Their glow never reached very far. Most cabins remained surprisingly dim after sunset. Every candle represented valuable tallow or beeswax that had taken considerable effort to produce. Families rarely burned more light than absolutely necessary. Eyes adapted. People accepted darkness as naturally as daylight. Modern cities rarely experience true night. Electric lights soften every corner. Street lamps illuminate roads. Homes glow from countless windows. Even distant horizons shimmer beneath artificial light. Early America offered something entirely different. When clouds covered the moon and stars, darkness became nearly complete. one could easily understand why unfamiliar sounds seemed so much larger after sunset. The storm intensified steadily. Snow struck the cabin walls with soft but persistent whispers. Wind pressed against the roof, searching patiently for weaknesses hidden beneath handmade shingles. Every few minutes, the chimney produced a low, hollow sound, unlike anything heard during warmer seasons. Inside, children instinctively moved closer to the fireplace. The oldest members of the household occasionally smiled, not because the weather amused them, but because every generation experienced this same quiet migration toward warmth. Humans have always gathered around fires, long before farms, long before colonies, long before written history itself. There is something deeply comforting about watching flames dance while cold waits outside. During these long evenings, clothing often received careful attention. A torn sleeve could become a serious problem later in the season. Needles moved steadily through thick wool, while fingers worked almost automatically after years of practice. Socks were darned repeatedly until very little original fabric remained. Gloves developed patches upon patches. Fashion held little importance during January. Warmth mattered. Wool dominated winter wardrobes because it continued insulating even when damp. Linen, commonly worn beneath heavier garments, remained useful despite offering little protection from severe cold. Fur appeared whenever available, especially around collars, hats, boots, and blankets. The wealthiest colonists naturally enjoyed better clothing than poorer families. Yet even prosperous households discovered that wealth alone could not conquer winter. A grand house still required endless firewood. Large rooms often proved more difficult to heat than modest cabins. Expensive windows collected frost just as quickly. Cold ignored social status with remarkable fairness. Outside, livestock endured the storm in quieter ways. Cattle stood together whenever possible, sharing body heat. Horses lowered their heads against blowing snow. Sheep crowded into tight groups until they almost appeared as one enormous creature beneath thick wool. Every animal represented an investment measured not only in money, but in future survival. A healthy cow meant milk. Oxen meant plowing when spring returned. Horses provided transportation. Chickens offered eggs. Losing livestock during winter meant facing the coming year with fewer opportunities to rebuild supplies. This explains why barns received nearly as much attention as homes. Many colonial barns were designed with practical simplicity, using stored hay not only as food, but also as insulation. Thick stacks of fodder helped reduce drafts, creating slightly warmer spaces for animals during bitter nights. Still, temperatures occasionally dropped low enough that water buckets froze solid before morning. Breaking ice became another ordinary chore. Imagine beginning every winter day by smashing frozen water with a wooden mallet before your animals could drink. It sounds exhausting because it was. The storm raged well into the evening. At times, the wind became loud enough to drown ordinary conversation. Snow squeezed through tiny gaps around the door, despite every effort to seal them. Someone periodically swept away the growing pile, forming just inside the entrance. Then came another familiar concern. The chimney. Heavy snowfall sometimes altered airflow enough to send smoke back into the cabin. Every family watched carefully for signs that the fire no longer breathed properly. Too much smoke indoors irritated eyes, damaged lungs, and in certain conditions became genuinely dangerous. Maintaining a fireplace required experience. Logs could not simply be thrown together carelessly. Different woods burned differently. Oak produced long-lasting coals. Pine ignited quickly, but sparked heavily. Hickory created excellent heat. Ash burned surprisingly well, even before becoming completely seasoned. Generations learned these differences not from books, but from countless winter evenings spent beside crackling fires. Outside, the world slowly disappeared beneath fresh snow. Fence rails vanished first, then shrubs, then low stone walls, marking old property lines. By midnight, familiar landmarks had become smooth white mounds, barely recognizable beneath drifting snow. If someone attempted to travel now, even across ground they had walked hundreds of times before, becoming lost was entirely possible. Snow erased memory. Paths disappeared. Creeks vanished beneath white blankets. Fields blended seamlessly into frozen woods. For this reason, experienced travelers often carried simple knowledge more valuable than expensive equipment. They observed tree lines. They remembered unusual rock formations. They watched prevailing winds. They paid attention to streams beneath the ice. The landscape itself became their map. Back inside the cabin, one by one, conversations faded. Children drifted into sleep beneath layers of quilts. Parents quietly checked the fire again. One final log, another careful adjustment, one more glance toward the sturdy door. The storm showed no sign of ending. Beyond those rough-hewn walls, millions upon millions of snowflakes continued falling across forests, rivers, villages, and lonely cabins scattered throughout the colonies. And by morning, the familiar world waiting outside would no longer look quite the same. Morning arrived so quietly that, for a few peaceful moments, it almost seemed as though the storm had never existed. No wind rattled the shutters. No branches scraped against the roof. The strange groaning sounds that had echoed through the darkness had disappeared completely, leaving behind a silence so complete that it felt almost tangible. It was the sort of silence that belongs only to heavy snowfall, when every hill, tree, and fence post is wrapped beneath a thick blanket of white that absorbs nearly every sound. Inside the cabin, however, the first sensation remained entirely familiar. Cold. The fire, despite every careful adjustment before bed, had settled into a bed of glowing coals. Enough warmth lingered to keep the room from freezing completely, yet not enough to make anyone eager to leave the comfort of their blankets. One by one, the household stirred. No alarm clock announced the beginning of the day. Instead, habit served as the family's timekeeper. Years of rising before sunrise had trained bodies to wake naturally, regardless of weather. There were animals to feed, fires to rebuild, and work waiting beyond the door. Or so everyone assumed. The oldest member of the household stepped toward the entrance first. He lifted the heavy wooden latch, pushed gently against the door, and nothing happened. He pushed harder. Still nothing. The snow had piled against the outside of the cabin during the night, pressing firmly enough that the door refused to open. This was hardly an unheard of problem. It happened often enough that many cabins included more than one exit whenever construction allowed. If a front door became trapped beneath drifting snow, another opening sometimes offered escape. Yet, smaller homes often possessed only a single entrance. For a few moments, the family simply listened. No voices, no wagon wheels, no distant axes striking wood, only stillness. Eventually, with steady pressure from inside, and determined, shoveling from a narrow opening near the threshold, enough snow gave way for the door to creak outward a few inches. A blast of icy air immediately filled the room. Outside stood a world transformed. The familiar yard had vanished beneath drifts, reaching nearly to the tops of fences. Snow had sculpted graceful curves across every surface. The woodpile resembled a row of sleeping white bears. Tree branches bent beneath enormous weight, their outlines softened until each oak and maple looked almost unreal against the pale morning sky. Sunlight reflected from the fresh snow with surprising brilliance. Without sunglasses, many settlers squinted for much of the morning. Snow blindness, caused by intense reflected sunlight, occasionally troubled hunters and travelers who spent long hours crossing open landscapes. Winter possessed a curious ability to combine breathtaking beauty with relentless hardship. The same snowfall that inspired quiet admiration also demanded hours of exhausting labor. The first task was obvious: clear a path. Wooden shovels scraped against packed snow. Each movement lifted only a small amount because heavy snow quickly exhausted even strong arms. Iron-edged tools existed, but many families relied upon simpler wooden designs made by local craftsmen, or even carved by hand during earlier seasons. The work seemed endless. Every few minutes, fresh powder slipped from roofs or nearby branches, undoing part of the progress already made. Sweat gathered beneath layers of wool despite temperatures far below freezing. This created another challenge. Perspiration became dangerous once hard work stopped. Damp clothing rapidly lost its ability to keep the body warm. Experienced settlers understood the importance of changing into dry garments whenever possible after strenuous outdoor labor. Those who ignored this lesson risked chills that could develop into serious illness. Modern outdoor clothing, designed to move moisture away from the skin, simply did not exist. Instead, people relied upon careful packing. Work hard, rest briefly, warm yourself by the fire, return outside, repeat. By late morning, a narrow trail connected the cabin to the barn. Reaching the animals came first. The moment the barn doors opened, warm breath drifted into the cold air like clouds of steam. The animals had survived the storm, though they were clearly hungry. Cows greeted their caretakers with low, impatient calls. Horses stamped their hooves against frozen ground. The sheep crowded together as tightly as they had throughout the night, reluctant to separate from the warmth of one another. Even chickens, usually energetic after sunrise, remained unusually quiet inside their coop. Hay disappeared quickly. Water buckets, frozen into solid blocks of ice, required considerable effort before the animals could drink. Wooden mallets struck repeatedly against thick ice until enough pieces broke away. Imagine performing this task every single winter morning. Then imagine doing it before eating breakfast yourself. Such routines became ordinary. The people living through them rarely considered them extraordinary, because nearly everyone shared the same experience. Comfort was measured differently. A warm meal, dry socks, enough firewood for another week, healthy livestock. These simple achievements represented genuine success. While chores continued, the youngest children often remained indoors, not because they disliked work, but because deep snow presented real danger. Small legs disappeared easily into drifts, falling into hidden hollows beneath accumulated snow. Occasionally trapped children until adults pulled them free. Inside the cabin, another kind of labor continued. Bread dough rested beneath linen cloth near the fireplace, where temperatures remained slightly warmer. Someone stirred a pot of bean stew that had simmered gently since dawn. A grandmother sat near the brightest window, carefully repairing a wool coat whose elbows had worn almost completely through. Nothing about these activities appeared dramatic, yet together they formed the invisible foundation of daily survival. History often remembers famous generals, celebrated politicians, and daring explorers. Far less attention is given to the thousands of anonymous hands that baked bread, stitched clothing, carried water, chopped wood, and quietly kept entire communities alive through unforgiving winters. Without them, history itself would have unfolded very differently. As the afternoon approached, the sky remained remarkably clear. The storm had moved eastward, leaving behind air so cold it almost sparkled. Smoke rose straight upward from scattered chimneys across the valley. That simple detail pleased experienced settlers. Straight smoke meant calm weather, at least for today. With conditions improving, some neighbors began checking on one another. This tradition carried deep importance. Travel after a storm was difficult, but concern outweighed inconvenience. An elderly widow living alone might need help clearing her doorway. A family with many young children could require extra firewood. Someone's roof might have partially collapsed beneath heavy snow. Colonial communities survived because isolation rarely meant abandonment. Knocking on a neighbor's door often began with practical questions. Has everyone eaten? Are your animals well? Do you need help with your chimney? These conversations reflected necessity more than ceremony. Sometimes visitors carried small gifts: a loaf of fresh bread, a pouch of dried apples, a few candles, perhaps a little extra salt. One of the most valuable household supplies available. Salt deserves a moment of appreciation. Today it sits almost unnoticed on kitchen tables around the world. In colonial America, however, it possessed extraordinary importance. Without reliable refrigeration, salt preserved meat throughout the year. It flavored otherwise plain meals. It helped preserve hides. It even played roles in certain medical treatments of the time. Running out of salt during winter created difficulties, extending far beyond bland suppers. Because of this, families guarded their supplies carefully. Trade routes often became unreliable once snow covered roads. Merchants delayed journeys until conditions improved, meaning shortages occasionally lasted weeks. Even something as ordinary as tea became uncertain. Many colonists simply drank warmed water, small beer, cider, or herbal infusions prepared from ingredients gathered during earlier seasons. Coffee remained uncommon in many settlements, particularly during the earlier colonial years. Warmth itself became part of every beverage. As daylight slowly faded once again, attention returned to the fireplace. Fire dominated nearly every aspect of winter life. It cooked meals, dried boots, heated water, provided light, protected against freezing temperatures. Yet it also demanded constant respect. A single stray spark landing upon dry straw or hanging cloth could destroy an entire cabin within minutes. Colonial settlements experienced devastating fires with alarming frequency. For that reason, ashes were removed carefully. Chimneys required regular cleaning whenever possible. Children learned from an early age that fireplaces were both trusted friends and dangerous neighbors. After supper, the family settled into another long evening. The meal itself was simple but filling. Bean stew thickened with bits of salted pork, dark bread baked from coarse flour, perhaps a small serving of preserved pumpkin or dried apples if supplies allowed. No elaborate desserts appeared. Sugar remained expensive. Fresh fruit belonged to another season entirely. Still, hunger rarely complained after a full day's labor in freezing weather. The simple act of sharing food beside a warm fire carried its own quiet satisfaction. Outside, the snow reflected the rising moon until the landscape glowed with a faint silver light. Fox tracks crossed the clearing sometime after sunset. A rabbit emerged cautiously from beneath a fallen pine. Far away, barely audible above the stillness, came the lonely howl of a wolf. The sound lingered across the frozen valley before fading once more into silence. Inside the cabin, no one seemed particularly alarmed. Wolves generally preferred easier meals than approaching occupied homes. Even so, livestock remained securely enclosed for good reason. Nature, beautiful as it often appeared, never stopped reminding people that survival required vigilance. The children listened to the distant howl with wide eyes. One quietly asked whether the wolves might come closer before morning. The oldest man in the room smiled gently before adding another piece of oak to the fire. He had heard that same question many winters before. He had probably asked it himself as a child. The flames brightened, sending warm orange light dancing across rough timber walls, while shadows stretched toward the ceiling. Outside, the moon climbed higher over the endless white landscape. Deep beneath the snow, seeds waited patiently for a spring they could not yet imagine. And although no one inside the cabin could possibly know it, the coldest weeks of the entire season were still waiting just beyond the horizon. The calendar, if the household owned one at all, insisted that winter was only halfway finished. To modern ears, that may sound merely inconvenient. To a family living in early America, it could feel deeply discouraging. There was a peculiar weight that settled over people during the middle weeks of winter. The excitement that sometimes accompanied the season's first snowfall had long since faded. Holiday celebrations, if they had been observed, were now distant memories. The landscape had remained white for so many weeks that many children could scarcely remember what green grass looked like. The novelty had disappeared. Only endurance remained. Days followed a rhythm that was both comforting and relentless. Wake before sunrise, coax the fire back to life, feed the animals, carry water, split wood, prepare meals, repair clothing, repeat. There were no weekends waiting at the end of the week, no vacation to anticipate. Nature itself determined the schedule, and nature was rarely interested in negotiation. As January slowly surrendered to February, the sun climbed a little higher each day, though the difference was almost impossible to notice without careful observation. Old farmers often claimed they could feel the changing light before they could measure it. Perhaps they could. People who lived outdoors for much of their lives developed remarkable sensitivity to subtle changes in the seasons. They noticed the angle of morning sunlight striking the barn wall. They recognized how shadows stretched differently across the yard. They listened for birds that returned days before anyone expected them. Such observations were not idle curiosity. They were practical knowledge. A mistake about the weather could prove costly. If someone assumed spring was arriving too early and allowed livestock onto sparse pasture before new grass had properly grown, animals might lose precious strength. If seeds were planted too soon, a late frost could destroy weeks of careful labor. Patience, though difficult, often became the wisest companion. One afternoon, while clearing another accumulation of snow from around the cabin, the youngest son paused to catch his breath. He looked toward the forest. Everything seemed perfectly still. Then he noticed movement. Not large, not sudden, just a few tiny shapes weaving between bare branches. Birds, a small flock, had returned after several quiet days. The sight lasted only a minute before they disappeared again. But it brightened everyone's mood far more than such a simple event might suggest. Small signs mattered enormously during winter. A bird, a patch of blue sky, the distant sound of running water beneath thinning ice. Each whispered that the frozen world had not been abandoned forever. Still, hope alone could not fill an empty pantry. By this point in the season, many households had begun taking careful inventory once again. The barrel of salted pork felt noticeably lighter. Only a few strings of dried onions remained hanging from the ceiling beams. The apples stored in the cellar had become softer with age. Some developed dark spots that required cutting away before the fruit could be eaten. Nothing edible was discarded without thought. A bruised apple might become part of a stew. Slightly stale bread found new life in thick soups. Bones from previous meals simmered for hours to produce nourishing broth. Colonial kitchens excelled at finding value where modern eyes might see only leftovers. Waste was considered almost disrespectful. After all, every ingredient represented months of labor. Someone had planted the crop. Someone had harvested it beneath the autumn sun. Someone had carried it, preserved it, stored it, and protected it from mice, moisture, and spoilage. Throwing food away meant throwing away pieces of one's own hard work. The cellar itself played a remarkable role during these long months. Unlike modern refrigerators powered by electricity, root cellars relied upon the natural insulation of the earth. Dug partially or entirely underground, they maintained cool, relatively stable temperatures throughout the year. Inside, shelves held jars of preserved vegetables. Wooden bins cradled potatoes, carrots, and turnips beneath layers of straw. Barrels lined the walls, each containing precious supplies intended to last until spring. The cellar smelled unmistakably of damp earth, wood, and stored harvests. For many children, entering it meant stepping into another little world beneath the house. Dimly lit, cool, quiet, almost mysterious. Yet even the finest cellar could not stop time. Every passing week reduced the family's reserves. This gradual disappearance created an emotional burden that history books seldom describe. Imagine watching your entire year's harvest become smaller every single day, knowing fresh food remained months away. Each scoop of grain carried silent arithmetic. Each loaf of bread invited calculation. How many meals remain? How much longer until planting season? Can the supplies stretch far enough? No one knew with complete certainty. These uncertainties shaped behavior in countless small ways. Second helpings became rarer. Guests, though always welcomed with kindness, were served thoughtfully. Children learned to finish every bite placed before them, not because parents wished to be strict, because abundance could never be assumed. Outside, another challenge quietly unfolded. Firewood. The stack that had seemed enormous during October now looked surprisingly modest. Every blazing evening had consumed another armful. Every freezing morning required fresh logs. Families occasionally underestimated how much wood an entire winter demanded. It was an easy mistake to make. During warm weather, neatly stacked piles looked almost endless. By February, they often appeared alarmingly small. This reality sometimes forced difficult decisions. Should larger logs be burned now for greater warmth? Or should they be saved for what everyone feared might become an even colder month ahead? There was no perfect answer, only careful judgment. Fortunately, not every family faced the season alone. In some settlements, neighbors occasionally organized shared woodcutting days whenever weather permitted. Several men would travel together into nearby forests. Axes echoed between snow-covered hills. Trees that had been marked months earlier finally fell with slow, echoing crashes. Branches were trimmed, logs cut. Teams of oxen hauled heavy loads back toward waiting homes. The work remained exhausting, but shared effort made impossible tasks achievable. Such gatherings often ended with simple meals enjoyed together. Perhaps steaming stew, fresh bread if flour allowed, warm cider heated over open flames. Conversation flowed more easily after a day's labor. News traveled this way. Someone mentioned a new family arriving several valleys away. Another shared word of successful hunting deeper in the woods. An older man recalled an even harsher winter decades earlier, insisting that rivers had frozen thicker than anyone living today had ever witnessed. Whether memory exaggerated slightly hardly mattered. These stories connected generations. They reminded younger settlers that hardship had been survived before, and therefore, perhaps, it could be survived again. Children absorbed these conversations with quiet fascination. Many learned practical wisdom simply by listening. Which trees burned longest? Where drifting snow usually hid dangerous holes. How to recognize the tracks of deer, foxes, rabbits, or wolves. When to trust frozen rivers. When to avoid them entirely. Formal schooling certainly taught reading and writing where available. Winter evenings taught survival. Not every lesson concerned nature. Character mattered just as much. Patience, steadiness, generosity, humility. These qualities became visible under difficult conditions. A selfish person might hoard supplies, while neighbors struggled. A generous one shared despite possessing little extra. Communities remembered such actions for years. Reputation traveled quickly through isolated settlements. Long after the snow melted, people still recalled who had helped others during the hardest weeks. One particularly cold evening, after the family finished supper, the youngest daughter wandered toward the window. She traced a tiny circle through the frost, covering the glass. Outside, stars filled the sky with astonishing brilliance. There were so many that they almost seemed impossible to count. Without electric lights dimming the heavens, the night revealed itself in extraordinary detail. The broad band of the Milky Way stretched overhead like pale smoke. Constellations appeared sharp enough to touch. Occasionally, a shooting star crossed the darkness before vanishing almost instantly. People often paused to admire such sights, despite the cold. The sky offered quiet companionship during long winters. It reminded them that seasons changed according to rhythms far older than any colony, far older than kingdoms, far older than memory itself. Nearby, the fire crackled softly, its steady rhythm blended with another familiar sound. Tick, 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 not from a modern clock. Many households possessed no mechanical timepiece at all. Instead, water occasionally dripped into iron pots, positioned near the hearth, where melting snow slowly collected. The gentle sound marked passing moments in its own humble way. Life moved more slowly then. Waiting formed part of nearly every activity. Bread required hours. Soap required days. Cloth required months. Homes required years. People developed expectations shaped by long effort rather than immediate results. Perhaps winter itself encouraged that mindset. Nothing could be hurried. Snow melted only when ready. Seeds sprouted only when warmth returned. No amount of wishing altered the calendar. As the family prepared for another night, the father stepped outside one final time. The air felt sharper than ever. His breath rose in thick white clouds before disappearing among the stars. He listened. Far away, an owl called from somewhere within the forest. Then silence. The snow beneath his boots squeaked with each step. A curious sound produced only when temperatures dropped exceptionally low. Experienced settlers recognized it instantly. Tomorrow, they knew without needing any instrument, would almost certainly be colder still. He gathered another armful of oak logs and returned indoors. carefully closing the heavy door behind him. The warmth embraced him immediately. Children already slept beneath patched quilts. The fire glowed steadily. His wife quietly finished mending another worn stocking. No one spoke for several minutes. There was no need. Outside, the wilderness rested beneath another crystal-clear winter night, beautiful enough to steal one's breath, and cold enough to steal much more than that. And somewhere beyond those endless forests, a traveler was beginning a journey through the frozen colonies, a journey that would reveal why winter roads were among the most feared places in early America. That traveler had delayed his departure for as long as he reasonably could. Every instinct urged him to remain where he was. The fire behind him was warm. The roof above him was sturdy. His hosts had offered another night's shelter without hesitation. As hospitality during winter was a tradition nearly as important as firewood itself, yet some journeys simply could not wait. Perhaps he carried legal papers that needed delivering before the next county court assembled. Perhaps he was a merchant attempting to reach a distant settlement before his remaining goods lost their value. Perhaps he had received word that a family member had fallen dangerously ill. Whatever the reason, necessity outweighed comfort. Before sunrise, while stars still glittered overhead, he prepared for the road. His clothing represented the best protection available. Several layers of linen rested closest to the skin. Over these came thick wool garments that trapped precious warmth. A heavy coat, stiff from repeated exposure to snow and smoke, covered everything else. Around his neck, he wrapped a long woolen scarf, while a broad felt hat shielded his face from wind. Thick mittens, far less graceful than gloves, but noticeably warmer, protected his hands. Even dressed this carefully, he knew the cold would eventually find him. It always did. Outside, his horse waited patiently beside the stable. A thin cloud of steam drifted from the animal's nostrils with every breath. The leather saddle had become so cold overnight that touching it with bare fingers felt almost painful. Before mounting, the traveler examined every strap. Winter punished carelessness. A broken stirrup, several miles from shelter, could transform inconvenience into genuine danger. Satisfied that everything remained secure, he climbed into the saddle and turned toward the narrow trail, disappearing into the forest. Within minutes, the cabin behind him vanished from sight. Snow-covered trees closed quietly around the road, like silent guardians. The path itself hardly deserved the name. Modern travelers imagine roads as carefully engineered surfaces with signs, bridges, and regular maintenance. Colonial roads were something quite different. Many consisted of little more than routes gradually worn into the landscape through repeated use. During summer, they became muddy ribbons carved by wagon wheels. During winter, they disappeared almost entirely beneath snow. Travelers navigated less by visible roads than by memory, landmarks, and experience. Every bend in the trail mattered. A certain unusually shaped oak, a large granite boulder resting beside a stream, a cluster of tall pines standing alone upon a hillside. These became natural signposts, guiding people across enormous stretches of wilderness. Heavy snowfall erased many of them. Branches drooped beneath fresh snow. Streams vanished beneath thick ice. Even familiar clearings looked strangely unfamiliar after several storms. The traveler urged his horse forward at a slow, steady pace. Speed accomplished little under such conditions. A horse slipping upon hidden ice risked serious injury to both rider and animal. Patience remained the safest companion. The forest seemed almost asleep. Bare branches stretched overhead like countless dark fingers reaching toward the pale winter sky. Occasionally, a squirrel darted across the snow, carrying some forgotten treasure hidden months earlier. Woodpeckers tapped patiently against frozen trunks in search of insects sheltered beneath bark. Otherwise, silence dominated everything. It was a remarkable silence, not empty, simply different. The usual chorus of summer insects had disappeared. Leaves no longer rustled overhead. Only the soft crunch of hooves pressing into snow accompanied the traveler through the woods. After several hours, the sun climbed higher, though it offered little warmth. Winter sunlight often deceived newcomers. It looked bright enough to promise comfort. Instead, the air remained sharp enough that every breath carried a faint sting. The traveler occasionally flexed his fingers inside thick mittens. Hands grew numb surprisingly quickly while holding leather reins. Many experienced riders alternated one hand at a time, briefly warming each beneath their coat whenever the trail allowed. Small habits like these often separated experienced travelers from inexperienced ones. Survival depended upon details. By midday, the road descended toward a frozen creek. Crossing water always demanded careful judgment. During warmer months, the stream posed little difficulty. Now its surface lay hidden beneath a broad sheet of ice, dusted with fresh snow. From a distance, it appeared perfectly solid. Appearances, however, could be dangerously misleading. The traveler dismounted, rather than trusting the crossing immediately. He used a long wooden staff to strike the ice several times. The sound mattered. Thick, healthy ice answered with a deep, solid note. Thin ice produced a sharper, uncertain sound that experienced ears learned to recognize. Even then, certainty remained impossible. He studied the surface carefully. No flowing water appeared. No suspicious cracks spread outward. Nearby animal tracks crossed safely from one bank to the other. These signs encouraged confidence, though never complete assurance. Leading his horse rather than riding, he stepped cautiously onto the frozen creek. Each footfall seemed unusually loud. The horse hesitated only briefly before following. For several long moments, the only sound came from boots and hooves pressing gently across packed snow. Then they reached the opposite bank without incident. The traveler allowed himself a slow breath of relief. Such crossings occurred countless times throughout colonial winters. Most ended uneventfully. Some did not. Historical records occasionally describe wagons breaking through unexpectedly. Livestock disappeared beneath icy water. Travelers found themselves soaked miles from shelter, facing conditions that quickly became life-threatening. Wet clothing and freezing temperatures formed an unforgiving combination. The journey continued. As afternoon approached, the weather began changing almost imperceptibly. A light breeze stirred high branches. Thin clouds drifted across the western horizon. Nothing alarming. Not yet. Still, experienced eyes noticed. One curious feature of winter landscapes was their tendency to magnify distance. Objects appeared closer than they truly were. A farmhouse glimpsed across an open field might require another hour to reach. Smoke rising from a distant chimney often inspired optimism that faded slowly as miles stretched longer than expected. The traveler understood this illusion well. He resisted the temptation to hurry. Instead, he watched the sun. Daylight remained precious. Winter afternoons disappeared with surprising speed. By what modern clocks would call 4 o'clock, shadows already lengthened dramatically across the snow. The forest darkened. Golden sunlight filtered between tree trunks, transforming ordinary branches into glowing columns of amber and bronze. Beautiful though it was, the changing light carried unmistakable warning. Night approached. Finding shelter before darkness became increasingly important. Colonial travelers relied upon several possibilities. An inn, if fortune smiled, a farmhouse willing to offer hospitality, perhaps a small settlement with enough space beside someone's hearth. Sleeping outdoors remained a last resort. Contrary to romantic paintings, spending a winter night beneath open skis was rarely peaceful, even with blankets and a fire. Temperatures frequently dropped low enough to challenge the strongest constitution. Snow accumulated while one slept. Wind shifted unexpectedly. Fuel for the fire dwindled before dawn. Many travelers therefore planned journeys carefully, estimating distances according to available shelter, rather than simply measuring miles. Late in the afternoon, the road curved around a low hill. Beyond it stood a modest farmhouse. Smoke curled steadily from its chimney. Several cattle occupied a nearby barn. A pair of children, bundled in thick coats, carried small baskets toward the woodshed. The sight brought quiet relief. Approaching respectfully, the traveler removed his hat before greeting the family. Such customs mattered. Politeness opened doors. Winter hospitality formed part of colonial life, not merely because people were generous, but because everyone understood how easily fortunes changed. Today's host might become tomorrow's weary traveler. The farmer listened patiently before nodding. There would be room beside the fire. The horse could shelter in the barn. A warm meal awaited shortly. No payment was mentioned immediately. That conversation could wait until morning. For now, warmth came first. Inside, the farmhouse resembled countless others scattered across the colonies. A broad fireplace dominated one wall. Bundles of dried herbs hung from ceiling beams. Simple wooden furniture surrounded a sturdy table worn smooth by decades of daily use. The room smelled pleasantly of wood smoke, fresh bread, and slowly simmering stew. Children glanced curiously at the unfamiliar visitor before returning politely to their chores. The traveler removed his snow-covered coat. Almost immediately, tiny droplets began melting onto the floor near the hearth. His boots, stiff with frozen snow, stood close enough to the fire to dry, but not so close that the leather would crack from excessive heat. Experience had taught people exactly how near such items should rest. Too close ruined them. Too far accomplished little. Supper that evening was modest, yet deeply satisfying. A thick stew of beans and salted meat. Fresh bread, still warm from the oven. A little butter, carefully spread in thin layers. Perhaps a mug of warmed cider, flavored with spices saved for special occasions. No one hurried through the meal. Winter encouraged lingering conversations. The traveler shared news gathered from distant settlements. A new mill had opened several counties away. Another village planned to expand its meeting house during spring. Someone spoke of unusually deep snow farther north. Another mentioned that the river downstream had frozen earlier than anyone could remember. Information traveled alongside people. Every guest carried pieces of the wider world. As darkness settled outside once more, the family gathered nearer the fireplace. The wind, almost unnoticed throughout the day, began whispering softly around the corners of the house. The traveler looked briefly toward the frost-covered window. Tomorrow's road still lay ahead. Many more miles, many more frozen rivers, many more lonely forests stretching across the young American colonies. He could only hope that the weather would remain kind for one more day. Winter, however, had always possessed plans entirely of its own. The wind began long before the snow returned. It slipped quietly through the treetops sometime after midnight, producing a low, steady murmur that drifted across the frozen countryside. Inside the farmhouse, where everyone slept beneath heavy quilts, the sound blended with the familiar crackling of the fireplace until it became little more than part of the night's background. The traveler noticed it first. Years spent moving from settlement to settlement had taught him that winter storms often announced themselves in stages. Snow could be troublesome enough, but wind possessed a different sort of character. It stole warmth from the body with alarming speed. It piled drifts across roads that had been perfectly clear only hours before. It found every loose shutter, every gap beneath a door, every weakness in a roof. By dawn, the murmur had become a steady whistle. The farmer stepped outside before breakfast, his boots sinking into yesterday's snow. He did not remain outdoors for long. The cold struck his face immediately, sharper than the previous afternoon. The breeze had strengthened considerably, carrying tiny crystals of loose snow that skimmed across the ground like pale ghosts. Above him, the sky remained mostly clear, yet the western horizon displayed long bands of gray cloud moving steadily eastward. He had seen skis like this many times. They rarely brought good news. Returning indoors, he stamped snow from his boots before hanging his thick coat beside the fire. It would be wise, he remarked calmly, to delay your journey another day. The traveler looked toward the window. He understood the advice. Every experienced person did. Still, delaying travel always carried consequences. Appointments were missed. Deliveries arrived late. Important letters remained undelivered. Yet winter had a remarkable way of reminding people that nature rarely concerned itself with human schedules. After a few thoughtful moments, he nodded. Another day it would be. No one considered the decision cowardly. Quite the opposite. Colonial life rewarded caution far more often than boldness. There existed an old understanding shared across many frontier communities. Reaching your destination one day late was infinitely preferable to never arriving at all. With the journey postponed, the day settled into familiar routines. The children, relieved to have another visitor in the house, eagerly asked questions about distant towns. Had he seen ships larger than churches? Were the streets in Boston truly crowded with merchants from many different lands? Did cities really contain buildings 3 stories high? The travelers smiled. To children raised among scattered farms and dense forests, even modest colonial towns sounded almost magical. He described busy marketplaces where wagons arrived daily carrying flour, barrels of fish, cloth, candles, tools, and imported goods from across the Atlantic. He spoke of church bells echoing through narrow streets, of blacksmiths whose hammers rang from sunrise until dusk, of harbors crowded with tall-masted ships, whose sails looked like great white wings against the sea. The children listened in complete fascination. To them, such places seemed unimaginably distant. Perhaps they always would. For many colonial families, travel beyond neighboring settlements remained uncommon. Life revolved around the immediate community. The nearest mill, the nearest church, the nearest trading post. These formed the center of the known world. Meanwhile, outside the farmhouse, the wind continued gathering strength. Snow that had rested peacefully upon rooftops all week suddenly lifted into swirling clouds. Fence lines disappeared beneath drifting powder. The tracks left by yesterday's wagon vanished within minutes. Nature erased evidence of human activity with effortless patience. Inside the barn, the farmer checked every animal once more. Winter storms demanded preparation, even when they ultimately proved less severe than expected. He spread fresh straw across the floor to provide better insulation. Extra hay filled the feeding racks. Water buckets were placed where they would be least likely to freeze quickly. His oldest son carefully examined the large wooden doors. Strong winds sometimes forced them open if latches became loose. Such a mistake could allow livestock to wander into the storm. Finding frightened animals afterward was often far more difficult than preventing the problem in the first place. The horse belonging to the traveler appeared unusually calm. Animals frequently sensed changing weather before people fully recognized it. Some became restless, others grew strangely quiet. Horses often turned their backs toward approaching wind, instinctively protecting their faces from blowing snow. The family dog refused to wander far from the porch that morning. Instead, it curled tightly beside the woodpile, lifting its head only occasionally before settling back into its sheltered corner. Even the chickens seemed reluctant to leave their coop. Small observations like these quietly confirmed what everyone already suspected. Another storm approached. As the hours passed, conversation drifted toward memories of remarkable winters from years gone by. The grandmother recalled a February so cold that laundry froze solid before it could be carried back indoors. She laughed softly while describing shirts hanging from clotheslines as stiff as wooden boards, standing almost upright after freezing in unusual shapes. The children found the image wonderfully amusing. In truth, it happened more often than one might imagine. Water trapped inside cloth froze almost immediately during periods of extreme cold. Families often completed the drying process indoors after bringing the rigid garments inside. Another story concerned maple trees. During late winter, when temperatures rose above freezing during the day, but dropped again at night, settlers collected sap flowing from sugar maples. Boiled slowly over many hours, the clear liquid eventually became maple syrup, or, with even more patience, maple sugar. This precious sweetness replaced expensive imported sugar in many homes. Yet timing mattered enormously. Tap the trees too early, and little sap flowed. Wait too long, and the season passed. Nature offered opportunities only within narrow windows. People learned to recognize them. Outside, clouds gradually swallowed the remaining patches of blue sky. The sunlight faded. By early afternoon, everything appeared wrapped beneath a pale silver light that cast almost no shadows. Snow began falling once more. Not heavily, at least not at first. Tiny flakes drifted lazily downward, spinning gently through the air. The children watched from the window with quiet excitement. Snow still carried a certain enchantment, despite the work it demanded. Each flake seemed unique. Together, they transformed entire landscapes. Within an hour, however, the snowfall thickened considerably. Wind seized countless flakes before they reached the ground, sending them racing sideways across open fields. Visibility shortened. The nearest trees softened into vague gray outlines. Beyond them, the forest disappeared altogether. Had the traveler chosen to leave that morning, he would now have found himself somewhere within that swirling whiteness, perhaps searching for a trail already buried, perhaps trying to distinguish sky from earth, perhaps wondering whether the dark shape ahead was a cabin or merely another cluster of snow-covered pines. Many accounts from Colonial America describe travelers becoming disoriented under precisely these conditions. The phenomenon later became known in many northern regions as a whiteout, when snow falls heavily while wind lifts older snow from the ground. The horizon simply vanishes. Distance becomes impossible to judge. One may unknowingly walk in circles despite believing the path remains perfectly straight, without familiar landmarks. Even experienced woodsmen occasionally lost their way. Such stories spread rapidly through frontier communities, not to frighten children, rather to encourage caution. Respect for winter formed an essential part of survival. As afternoon darkened into evening, the family remained comfortably indoors. The traveler offered to help split kindling beneath the woodshed roof, where snow could not reach them. The farmer accepted gratefully. Axes rose and fell with steady rhythm. Freshly split oak released its pleasant earthy scent into the cold air. Neat stacks of firewood slowly grew taller. No one complained about extra supplies. Wood represented warmth. Warmth represented life. Inside, the women kneaded fresh bread, while an iron kettle simmered gently above glowing coals. The smell of baking filled every corner of the farmhouse. Simple aromas often carried extraordinary comfort during winter. Fresh bread, wood smoke, stew rich with herbs, melted butter. These familiar scents reassured people that, despite the storm gathering outside, home remained secure. Evening arrived earlier than anyone expected. Heavy clouds swallowed what little daylight remained. Candles flickered to life. The storm tapped steadily against the windows. Every so often, a stronger gust rattled the shutters before fading once again into the endless howl of the wind. The children gathered near the hearth, where the grandmother reached for a well-worn family Bible. Reading aloud became a cherished winter tradition in many households fortunate enough to own books. Books themselves remained valuable possessions. Printing existed, certainly, but volumes were still expensive compared with modern standards. Many families owned only a Bible, an almanac, and perhaps one or two additional works. Those few books were read repeatedly throughout the years. Their pages carried fingerprints from several generations, margins occasionally held handwritten notes recording births, marriages, deaths, or unusually memorable events. A family Bible often served as both sacred text and historical record. Tonight, however, even the familiar words occasionally paused beneath louder gusts of wind. The house creaked softly, timbers settled. Somewhere in the chimney, the draft shifted with a low humming sound. The traveler glanced toward the fire. He felt quietly grateful that wisdom had outweighed urgency that morning. Beyond those sturdy walls, winter once again reminded everyone that it governed the roads, the forests, and the frozen rivers according to its own unchanging rules. And before the next sunrise, those rules would be tested by people far less fortunate than the family gathered safely around this welcoming fire. Long before the first light touched the eastern horizon, someone was already awake in another corner of the colony, not because they wished to be, because necessity had quietly called them from sleep. Several miles away, beyond forests now hidden beneath another layer of drifting snow, a woman sat beside a small bed where her youngest child had been coughing throughout the night. The little room was dim, except for the soft glow of a single candle that had nearly burned itself away. Every few minutes, she placed the back of her hand against the child's forehead, searching for signs that the fever had lessened. It had not. Her husband stood silently near the fireplace, staring into the flames while weighing impossible choices. The nearest physician lived many miles away. Under pleasant summer skis, the journey might require most of a day. During a February snowstorm, no one could say. He knew the roads. He knew the forests. He knew the frozen creek crossings. He also knew that every hour spent traveling carried its own danger. Yet remaining home meant watching helplessly, while illness continued its uncertain course. Such moments occurred far more often than modern readers sometimes imagine. Today, reaching medical care often involves little more than a short drive or a telephone call. In early America, distance itself frequently became part of the illness. Doctors were scarce, especially in isolated settlements. Many communities depended instead upon experienced midwives. Herbal knowledge passed through generations, practical remedies, and the careful attention of family members. These approaches often helped. Sometimes they did not. Nature offered no guarantees. After several quiet moments, the father made his decision. He would ride. Outside, the storm had eased slightly since midnight, though the wind continued driving loose snow across every open space. Visibility remained poor. The horse, already saddled beneath the small stable roof, stamped impatiently as the man tightened the final leather strap. His wife wrapped another wool scarf around his neck. Neither spoke very much. There were few useful words for such mornings. He mounted quickly, glanced back toward the cabin one final time, and disappeared into the pale gray dawn. The forest welcomed him with silence. Fresh snow covered yesterday's tracks completely. Branches bent beneath heavy white burdens. Every familiar landmark seemed subtly altered, forcing him to rely less upon sight and more upon memory. He knew this trail. He had walked it during spring rains. He had ridden it beneath brilliant autumn leaves. He had crossed it while carrying harvest supplies before the first frost. Winter transformed it into something almost unrecognizable. The road narrowed where drifting snow filled old wagon ruts. Fallen branches, weakened beneath accumulated ice, blocked several stretches entirely. More than once, he dismounted to pull smaller limbs aside so the horse could continue. Progress became painfully slow, yet hurrying solved nothing. A frightened horse, slipping upon hidden ice, could end the journey before it truly began. So he continued steadily, step by careful step, mile by difficult mile. Elsewhere across the colonies, countless families faced similar realities every winter. Some sought physicians, others searched for blacksmiths capable of repairing broken tools. Merchants attempted to reach distant markets before essential supplies ran short. Ministers traveled between scattered congregations despite deep snow and uncertain weather. Not every journey ended successfully. Some travelers became stranded when storms arrived earlier than expected. Others accepted shelter with strangers, remaining several days until roads improved. These interruptions were considered ordinary. Winter possessed authority that few questioned. Back at the farmhouse, where the travelers still waited for calmer weather, morning unfolded at a gentler pace. The storm had weakened overnight. Only occasional gusts disturbed the otherwise peaceful landscape. After breakfast, the farmer suggested inspecting the maple grove lying beyond the western field. "It is still early," he remarked thoughtfully, "but the trees may soon begin waking." The traveler accepted the invitation. Together, they walked through fresh snow that reached nearly halfway to their knees. Each step produced the familiar crisp squeak, heard only during especially cold mornings. The sound amused the traveler. Different regions possessed different kinds of snow. Dry powder behaved unlike heavy wet snowfall. Older settlers often claimed they could predict changing temperatures simply by listening to the snow beneath their boots. Perhaps experience truly taught such things. Reaching the grove, they paused among tall sugar maples, whose bare branches stretched gracefully against the pale winter sky. To an unfamiliar observer, the trees appeared lifeless. The farmer knew better. Beneath rough gray bark, countless tiny channels quietly waited for the changing rhythm of the season. Soon, perhaps within only a few weeks, warmer afternoons followed by freezing nights would encourage sap to begin flowing upward once again. When that happened, families would drill small holes into selected trees, insert simple wooden spouts, and collect the clear liquid in buckets. The process required remarkable patience. 40 gallons of sap might produce only 1 gallon of syrup after many hours of careful boiling. Maple sugar demanded even more effort, yet the reward justified every hour spent tending the fire. Sweetness remained precious. Imported cane sugar reached colonial households only through expensive trade. Maple sugar, by contrast, grew quietly in the forests themselves. Nature offered generosity to those willing to understand her calendar. The farmer gently rested one gloved hand against the trunk of a large maple. "My father tapped this one," he said softly, "and his father before him." The travelers smiled. Certain trees outlived several generations of people. They became silent witnesses to changing colonies, growing families, and passing seasons. Long after cabins collapsed and fences disappeared, those same maples often continued standing. History surrounded early Americans in subtle ways, not only through books or monuments, but through forests, fields, stone walls, ancient trees. Returning toward the farmhouse, they noticed fresh tracks crossing the snow. Rabbit, fox, then something considerably larger. The farmer crouched carefully. He brushed away loose powder until the outline became clearer. Deer, several of them, probably moving before sunrise. The tracks wandered toward a patch of cedar where winter shelter remained plentiful. Animals constantly adjusted their movements according to weather. Hunters understood these patterns intimately. Successful winter hunting depended less upon luck than observation. Food shortages occasionally made hunting essential. Venison supplemented dwindling supplies of salted meat. Rabbits appeared frequently in stews. Wild turkeys, though more difficult to find beneath deep snow, occasionally rewarded persistent effort. Every successful hunt strengthened the household's chances of reaching spring comfortably. Still, hunting itself remained uncertain. Game grew scarcer after repeated storms. Animals conserved energy, moving less whenever possible. Sometimes an entire day passed without opportunity. Returning empty-handed was simply accepted as part of the experience. By midday, the clouds finally began breaking apart. Small patches of blue appeared overhead. Sunlight spilled across the snowy fields, causing millions of tiny ice crystals to sparkle brilliantly. The children rushed outdoors almost immediately. After several storm-bound days, even ordinary play felt wonderfully exciting. They built rough snow forts beside the barn, threw carefully packed snowballs, laughed whenever someone slipped into a drift deeper than expected. Winter was not entirely misery. Even during the hardest seasons, moments of genuine happiness quietly appeared. Children discovered joy where adults often saw only work. A frozen pond became an adventure. Fresh snowfall became an invitation. Icicles hanging from the roof resembled glittering castles. Such simple pleasures softened difficult months. The adults watched with quiet amusement. Perhaps they remembered their own childhood winters. Perhaps the laughter itself made the cold feel slightly less severe. As afternoon drifted toward evening once again, the traveler began preparing for departure. The weather looked considerably more promising. Roads would remain difficult, certainly, yet tomorrow seemed likely to offer safer conditions. His horse had rested well. Supplies were reorganized carefully. Bread, dried meat, and a small pouch of oats were packed securely for the journey. The farmer's wife quietly added several pieces of fresh bread, wrapped in clean linen. For the road, she said with a gentle smile. The traveler thanked her sincerely. Small kindnesses like these echoed across colonial America. One loaf shared today might sustain someone many miles from home tomorrow. Such generosity rarely appeared in official records. Yet without it, countless journeys would have ended very differently. That evening, after supper, the family lingered around the fireplace longer than usual. The traveler would leave before sunrise. The children asked whether he might someday return. He admitted that perhaps he would. Roads had a curious way of bringing familiar faces together again. Outside, the wind had finally grown quiet. The stars returned one by one above the snow-covered countryside. The storm had passed, but winter itself had not. Beyond the peaceful farm, rivers remained frozen. Forests stretched for hundreds of silent miles. Entire settlements still measured every meal, every log, and every remaining week until spring. And somewhere to the north, where temperatures had fallen even lower than here, people were preparing to face one of the most unforgiving cold spells the colonies had experienced in many years. Before dawn, the farmhouse stirred once again. The familiar rhythm of winter mornings unfolded almost without words. A log settled in the fireplace with a soft crack. Someone lifted the heavy iron kettle onto glowing coals. The smell of fresh bread, baked the evening before, mingled with the comforting scent of wood smoke that had long since soaked into every beam, blanket, and coat within the house. The traveler dressed quietly. His clothes, which had dried thoroughly beside the hearth overnight, felt stiff, but wonderfully warm compared with the frozen garments he had removed 2 days earlier. Outside, the world seemed transformed once again. The storm had polished everything. Fresh snow rested smoothly upon fences and rooftops, untouched except for a scattering of rabbit tracks that wandered across the yard sometime before sunrise. Above, the sky was perfectly clear. Not a single cloud interrupted the deep winter blue. Beautiful weather, experienced settlers knew, often accompanied the coldest mornings of the season. Without clouds to trap warmth near the ground, temperatures plunged during the night. The air felt almost glass-like. Every breath emerged as a thick white cloud before disappearing into the stillness. The farmer walked beside the traveler toward the stable. Neither man hurried. There was an unspoken understanding that every departure during winter deserved careful preparation. The horse's hooves were examined for packed ice. The saddle straps were checked once more. A small bundle containing bread, smoked meat, and a flask of warmed cider was tied securely behind the saddle. Simple precautions often prevented larger problems many miles down the road. As the first pale light appeared above the eastern trees, the traveler mounted his horse. He thanked the family once more. The children waved enthusiastically from the doorway. The farmer lifted one gloved hand in farewell. Then, with a gentle nudge of his heels, the horse stepped onto the snow-covered road. Within moments, both rider and horse became smaller against the endless white landscape. Soon, they disappeared completely among the trees. The farmhouse settled back into its ordinary routine. Winter rarely paused simply because a visitor had departed. There were animals to feed, ashes to remove, water to fetch, wood to split. Life continued. The traveler, meanwhile, discovered almost immediately that the storm had altered the road far more than he expected. Deep drifts had formed wherever the trail crossed open fields. In sheltered forests, however, conditions improved considerably. Tall pines protected the snow from drifting winds, leaving a firmer surface beneath the horse's hooves. Experience taught travelers to appreciate such natural shelter. The forest itself often became an ally. Its trees reduced wind. Its branches caught falling snow. Its familiar landmarks offered guidance when open country became confusing. By mid-morning, sunlight filtered through the evergreens in brilliant shafts of gold. The snow reflected so much light that the woods seemed to glow from within. Tiny crystals sparkled everywhere. Even the smallest branch shimmered, as though decorated with countless diamonds. Moments like these reminded people that winter possessed extraordinary beauty alongside its hardships. Many settlers spoke quietly of such mornings for years afterward, not because they had accomplished anything remarkable, simply because nature had revealed herself in one of her gentlest moods. The traveler paused briefly beside a small stream. Unlike many larger rivers, this one had not frozen completely. Dark water flowed steadily beneath shelves of thick ice lining each bank. Steam drifted upward, where slightly warmer water met bitterly cold air. He knelt carefully and filled a small wooden cup. The water tasted astonishingly fresh, cold enough to make his teeth ache, yet wonderfully clear. Clean water remained one of the frontier's greatest blessings. In growing towns, wells occasionally became contaminated, spreading illness through crowded neighborhoods. Out here, flowing streams generally offered safer drinking water. The wise travelers still chose sources carefully. Moving water was preferred. Stagnant pools invited unnecessary risk. As he continued his journey, signs of other travelers gradually appeared. A single set of wagon tracks crossed the road. Several footprints led toward a nearby stand of cedar, before disappearing again. Fresh horse droppings indicated someone had passed perhaps only an hour earlier. On lonely winter roads, such discoveries carried quiet reassurance. They reminded travelers that the wilderness, vast though it seemed, was not entirely empty. Toward noon, the trail climbed steadily onto higher ground. From the crest of the ridge, the traveler paused once more. The view stretched for miles. Endless forests rolled across the landscape like frozen waves. Here and there, faint columns of smoke rose from distant cabins hidden among the trees. Each thin ribbon of smoke represented a family gathered around its fire, children completing chores, bread baking in iron ovens, stories shared beside glowing embers. From this distance, the settlements appeared peaceful, almost timeless, yet the traveler knew every chimney concealed its own struggles. Every household worried about food lasting until spring. Every family counted its remaining firewood. Every parent hoped illness would stay away during the hardest weeks of the year. Distance softened reality. Living it was another matter entirely. Descending the ridge required careful attention. Snow concealed patches of smooth ice beneath. The horse picked its way slowly, placing each hoof with remarkable caution. Animals often displayed better judgment than people under such conditions. Many experienced riders learned the wisdom of trusting their horses. If the animal hesitated unexpectedly, there was usually a reason. At the bottom of the hill, the road entered another small settlement consisting of only half a dozen cabins surrounding a modest meeting house. Smoke drifted peacefully from every chimney. Children hauled sleds loaded with split firewood between buildings. 2 women carried buckets from a shared well, laughing together despite the cold. Nearby, a blacksmith worked inside his small forge. Bright orange sparks burst into the air each time his hammer struck glowing iron. The rhythmic ringing echoed across the snowy village. Such sounds brought unexpected comfort. They suggested ordinary life, continuing despite winter's hardships. The traveler stopped briefly to allow his horse a short rest. While standing near the blacksmith shop, he noticed several farmers gathered nearby discussing the weather. One elderly man pointed toward the western sky. "Watch the crows," he remarked quietly. Sure enough, a large flock circled unusually low above the treetops before settling together within dense evergreens. Another farmer nodded knowingly. They're seeking shelter. Weather signs fascinated colonial communities. Long before scientific forecasting, people relied upon generations of careful observation. Some beliefs later proved remarkably accurate. Others belonged more to folklore than meteorology. Still, nearly everyone paid close attention. The thickness of squirrel nests, the height at which birds built their homes, the color of sunsets, the behavior of livestock, the shape of clouds, even the appearance of the moon. Every clue offered a possible glimpse into tomorrow, not because people wished to control nature, because they wished to prepare for it. After thanking the villagers for their hospitality, the traveler resumed his journey. The afternoon passed quietly. The road gradually improved as it approached larger settlements where greater numbers of wagons packed the snow into firmer surfaces. Travel remained slow, but noticeably easier than before. Then, shortly before sunset, something unusual caught his attention. Ahead, near the edge of the road, stood a young boy. Alone, he appeared no older than 10. His thick wool coat hung awkwardly around his shoulders. A bundle of firewood rested at his feet. The boy seemed neither frightened nor injured, simply waiting. The traveler slowed his horse immediately. As he approached, the child looked up with surprising calm. "My father said someone would come before dark," the boy explained politely. "He sent me to watch the road." The traveler glanced toward the forest. Sure enough, smoke drifted upward only a short distance away. A cabin remained hidden among the trees. The father soon emerged, waving gratefully. Their wagon axle had broken earlier that afternoon while returning from a neighboring farm, unable to repair it before nightfall. They had hoped to find assistance from the next traveler passing along the road. Such encounters happened more frequently than modern readers might expect. Roads were unpredictable. Equipment failed. Horses became lame. Wheels cracked beneath heavy loads. In isolated country, strangers often became unexpected neighbors for a few hours. Without hesitation, the traveler dismounted. Together, the two men examined the damaged wagon. The axle had indeed split cleanly through. Repairing it completely would require a skilled wheelwright. But perhaps, just perhaps, there might be a temporary solution, sturdy enough to carry the family safely home before darkness fully settled over the frozen countryside. The broken axle rested at an awkward angle beneath the wagon, half buried in packed snow. For a few moments, neither man spoke. There was little use in pretending the damage was minor. A wagon axle was one of the strongest pieces of wood on the entire vehicle, carved carefully from seasoned timber capable of supporting tremendous weight. If it failed, the journey usually ended right there. Yet winter had a way of encouraging creativity. The traveler knelt beside the wheel, brushing loose snow away with his mitten. The split ran nearly through the entire beam. Not impossible to manage, but certainly impossible to ignore. The farmer crouched beside him. "I have rope," he offered, "and a few iron straps." The traveler nodded thoughtfully. "That may be enough." The next half hour passed in steady, practical work. The damaged section was wrapped tightly with 2 iron bands, originally intended for securing cargo. Thick rope was wound around them again and again until both men could scarcely force another loop into place. Finally, they wedged a carefully shaped piece of hardwood beneath the crack to reduce the strain resting on the weakened beam. It was not a proper repair. Everyone knew that, but it might survive the short distance back to the cabin if the wagon moved slowly enough. The father smiled with quiet relief. Sometimes winter did not require perfection, only something good enough to reach shelter. The young boy, who had waited patiently beside the road throughout the repairs, gathered his bundle of firewood once more. He looked no older than 10, yet he carried himself with surprising confidence. Children on the frontier matured quickly. Responsibility arrived early. By the age of 10, many boys already knew how to handle an axe safely, tend livestock, identify animal tracks, and assist with planting or harvesting. Girls of similar age often baked bread, spun wool, cared for younger siblings, and helped preserve food for winter. Their childhood certainly included moments of play, but necessity remained an everyday teacher. As the repaired wagon creaked slowly forward, the traveler walked beside it for several minutes, watching carefully for signs that the temporary repair might fail. The wheels rolled steadily. The axle groaned once or twice, but held firm. After reaching the narrow lane leading toward the family's cabin, the farmer stopped the wagon and extended his hand. "I shall remember this kindness." The traveler accepted the handshake warmly. He understood that gratitude moved in both directions. Had their positions been reversed, he hoped another stranger would have offered the same assistance. Such exchanges quietly strengthened frontier communities. Many acts of generosity never appeared in diaries. No newspaper reported them. No monument commemorated them. Yet these small moments formed the invisible threads that held scattered settlements together. With daylight fading rapidly, the traveler continued alone. The western sky had begun displaying soft shades of amber and rose. Snow-covered hills reflected those colors gently, transforming the landscape into something almost dreamlike. For a little while, the hardships of winter seemed to retreat behind extraordinary beauty. Even the bare branches overhead glowed warmly beneath the setting sun. Nature possessed curious timing. Often her harshest seasons also produced her most breathtaking scenes. The traveler found himself slowing, almost unconsciously, not because the road demanded it, because the evening invited quiet observation. A pair of deer emerged cautiously from the edge of the forest. They crossed the snowy trail perhaps 50 yards ahead, their slender legs moving gracefully despite the deep drifts. For several seconds they paused, ears turning toward the unfamiliar sound of approaching hoofbeats. Then, with effortless elegance, they disappeared once more among the pines. Moments like this reminded many early Americans that they shared the wilderness rather than conquered it. The forests remained immense. People occupied only small clearings, carved patiently from endless woods. Beyond those scattered farms, nature continued following rhythms that had existed long before the first European ships reached American shores. As darkness approached, Another concern gradually entered the traveler's mind. Finding shelter, he estimated that the nearest inn still lay several miles ahead. Under ordinary conditions, the distance posed little difficulty, but winter daylight faded astonishingly quickly. Within half an hour, the golden glow disappeared completely. Blue shadows stretched across the snow. Soon afterward, they merged into evening itself. The moon had not yet risen. The forest became noticeably darker. The traveler resisted any temptation to increase his speed. Many accidents occurred during these uncertain twilight hours. Hidden branches, snow-covered rocks, unexpected patches of ice. The safest pace remained the slow one. Then, far ahead, a tiny point of orange light appeared between the trees. It flickered gently before vanishing behind a stand of evergreens. Moments later, it appeared again. A lantern, perhaps hanging outside an inn, perhaps carried by another traveler, perhaps suspended beside a farmhouse entrance. Whatever its source, it represented something deeply comforting. Human presence, warmth, safety. Gradually, the light grew brighter. Soon the outline of a modest roadside tavern emerged from the darkness. Compared with grand coaching inns found in larger European cities, the building appeared remarkably simple. A broad stone chimney, 2 stories, constructed from heavy timber, a weathered wooden sign swinging gently above the entrance. A stable stood nearby, already sheltering several horses whose quiet movements could be heard through the still evening air. The traveler smiled. His day would end beside a fire after all. Inside, warmth embraced him almost immediately. The common room buzzed softly with conversation. Several merchants sat around one table discussing prices for flour and tobacco. Near the fireplace, 2 teamsters warmed stiff hands after spending the day guiding heavily loaded wagons through snowy roads. An elderly woman quietly knitted wool stockings while listening to everyone's conversations with gentle amusement. The innkeeper greeted the traveler cheerfully. Hospitality formed an essential part of such establishments. Travelers brought news. News attracted customers. Customers brought income. Everyone benefited. After caring for the horse, the traveler settled near the large fireplace. The flames burned brightly, fueled by thick oak logs that released steady heat throughout the room. His boots steamed gently as melting snow soaked into the rushes scattered across the wooden floor. Someone handed him a warm bowl of stew. He accepted gratefully. Simple food always tasted richer after a day spent in freezing air. Conversations drifted naturally from one topic to another. Road conditions, upcoming market days, rumors of unusually deep snow farther north. One merchant mentioned hearing that an entire shipment of imported cloth remained delayed because coastal harbors had become clogged with floating ice. Another described frozen rivers carrying enormous chunks of broken ice downstream after brief thaws. Each story reminded listeners that winter influenced nearly every aspect of colonial life. Commerce slowed, mail arrived late, construction paused, fishing became difficult, even communication between neighboring towns occasionally ceased for days. No part of society escaped the season entirely. Eventually, attention turned toward the oldest man in the room. His white beard reached almost to the middle of his chest. Years had curved his back slightly, yet his eyes remained remarkably bright. Someone asked whether he remembered the legendary winter spoken of by nearly everyone in the county. The old gentleman chuckled softly. "Oh, I remember." The room grew noticeably quieter. Even those pretending not to listen subtly leaned closer. He stared thoughtfully into the fire before speaking again. It was the winter when people said the cold itself made strange sounds. A few younger listeners exchanged curious glances. The old man continued. Trees cracked during the night loudly enough to wake entire households. Rivers froze so deeply that men crossed places they had never dared cross before. We found birds frozen beneath hedges after a single bitter night. He paused long enough to sip his cider. But that was not the hardest part. The room remained silent. The hardest part, he said quietly, was not knowing when it would end. No one interrupted, because everyone understood. Cold could be endured. Heavy snow could be shoveled. Wood could be chopped. But uncertainty, that settled into people's hearts more deeply than frost settled into the ground. The traveler listened carefully. Outside, the wind had begun rising once again. Not violently, just enough to make the tavern sign creak softly against its iron chain. Inside, the fire continued glowing warmly. Voices remained calm. Stew simmered gently in the kitchen. For tonight, everyone present enjoyed comfort. Yet beyond the lantern light surrounding the inn, thousands of families across the colonies still faced another long winter night, counting firewood, stretching food supplies, tending sick children, and waiting patiently for a spring that always arrived. But never quite as soon as anyone wished. Morning at the roadside tavern began well before sunrise. The innkeeper had already been awake for nearly an hour, feeding thick oak logs into the enormous fireplace that dominated the common room. By the time the first guests wandered downstairs, the air carried the comforting aroma of fresh bread, simmering oats, and coffee made from precious imported beans that many ordinary families still considered an occasional luxury. Outside, however, winter remained firmly in command. The windows were coated with delicate sheets of frost, so intricate they resembled lace, carefully etched across the glass. Tiny ferns, stars, and curling vines stretched from corner to corner, created not by an artist's hand, but by the slow work of freezing moisture during the night. One by one, the travelers gathered around the breakfast table. Conversation remained quieter than it had the evening before. People naturally spoke less before the day had fully begun. Someone buttered a thick slice of bread. Another carefully folded a map, already softened by years of travel. A merchant counted silver coins beneath the table, making certain enough remained to pay for lodging farther down the road. The elderly gentleman who had spoken beside the fire the previous evening stirred his porridge thoughtfully without saying a word. Eventually, the innkeeper glanced toward the window. "It looks colder." Several people stood to see for themselves. He was correct. No fresh snow had fallen overnight. The sky remained perfectly clear, yet something about the morning felt sharper than before. The trees stood absolutely motionless. Smoke from nearby chimneys rose perfectly straight upward, without the slightest hint of drifting sideways. Experienced settlers often regarded such still mornings with cautious respect. Calm air frequently accompanied extraordinary cold. The traveler stepped outside after breakfast. The sensation was immediate. His nostrils tingled with every breath. The exposed skin across his cheeks tightened almost instantly. Even the leather reins hanging beside his horse felt unusually stiff after spending the night in freezing temperatures. Nearby, one of the merchants attempted to speak before laughing quietly. "My beard has frozen already." Indeed, tiny crystals had formed upon his whiskers, simply from moisture in his own breath. Such sights became surprisingly common during particularly severe weather. Men with long beards occasionally found thin layers of frost clinging to the hair around their mouths. After only a few minutes outdoors, scarves stiffened, hat brims sparkled, even eyelashes sometimes gathered delicate white crystals. The body itself quietly revealed the intensity of the cold. Before leaving, every traveler devoted extra attention to preparation. Water flasks were checked, blankets secured, horses brushed carefully to remove snow trapped beneath their winter coats. Animals deserved just as much consideration as people. A tired horse could not simply be replaced halfway through the wilderness. Its strength often determined whether the entire journey succeeded. The road south gradually descended into a broad valley where several farms rested beside a winding river. From a distance, smoke curled peacefully above scattered chimneys. Fields disappeared beneath smooth blankets of snow stretching, uninterrupted, to distant tree lines. At first glance, everything appeared calm, peaceful, almost effortless, yet appearances often disguised enormous labor. Each farmhouse represented years of work. Every split rail fence had been shaped by hand. Every cleared field once formed part of the surrounding forest. Even now, beneath the snow, stone walls marked property boundaries, assembled one rock at a time. As generations removed countless stones from their fields before planting crops, winter covered these achievements with remarkable generosity. The snow made everything appear gentle. It concealed the endless effort beneath. As the traveler continued, he noticed several figures moving slowly across one distant hillside. Curiosity encouraged him to pause. Through the bare branches, he could make out 3 men pulling what appeared to be a large wooden sled. No horses, no oxen, only human effort. The load itself consisted entirely of freshly cut logs. The men leaned forward together, ropes stretched tightly across their shoulders as they hauled the heavy timber downhill toward a waiting cabin. Modern readers might reasonably wonder why anyone would choose such exhausting work. The answer lay beneath the snow itself. Winter often made transporting heavy logs easier rather than harder. A wooden sled glided across, packed snow far more smoothly than wagon wheels rolled through muddy spring roads. Many settlers deliberately waited until winter to move enormous timbers needed for building barns, houses, or mills. Frozen ground supported tremendous weight. Snow reduced friction. The season that complicated so many other tasks quietly simplified this one. Winter rarely offered only disadvantages. People gradually learned to work with the season rather than constantly struggle against it. Later that morning, the traveler reached a small bridge crossing the river, or rather, where the bridge should have been. He slowed immediately. The structure remained standing, but enormous chunks of river ice had piled against its wooden supports during a recent thaw before freezing solid once again. The pressure had twisted several beams noticeably. Crossing demanded careful judgment. A farmer waiting nearby shook his head slowly. "I crossed yesterday." He pointed toward one badly bent support. "I would not risk it today." Together they studied the bridge in silence. Then the farmer gestured farther upstream. "There is a ford." The traveler raised an eyebrow. "In winter?" The farmer nodded. "The river there is shallow enough that the ice freezes thicker." No map mentioned such details. Knowledge like this lived in memory, passed from neighbor to neighbor, father to son, hunter to traveler. Without local guidance, strangers often overlooked safer routes, lying only a short distance away. Following the farmer's directions, they soon reached a broad bend where the river widened considerably. Here the water moved more slowly. Snow-covered ice stretched from bank to bank. Still, both men proceeded cautiously. They tested the surface repeatedly with long poles. The farmer crossed first. The traveler followed several yards behind. The ice groaned softly beneath the horses, not cracking, merely settling. Even so, every step demanded complete attention. Halfway across, the traveler glanced downward through patches of unusually clear ice. Dark water flowed silently several feet below. The sight encouraged him not to linger. Within minutes, they reached the opposite bank safely. The farmer smiled. Not every shortcut saves time. The traveler laughed gently. Some save lives. After thanking one another, their roads separated once again. Such brief partnerships occurred constantly during colonial travel. People who had never met before shared advice, crossed dangerous rivers together, exchanged news, then continued in opposite directions, perhaps never seeing one another again. The afternoon passed beneath brilliant sunshine, yet temperatures barely climbed. The snow retained its dry, powdery texture. Every footstep continued producing that distinctive squeaking sound heard only during extreme cold. The traveler reflected upon how differently winter shaped daily life. Entire occupations adjusted their schedules around the season. Millers worried whether streams provided enough flowing water to turn great wooden wheels. Fishermen watched river ice carefully. Blacksmiths remained busier than ever repairing tools that broke under harsh conditions. Carpenters often shifted from outdoor construction to crafting furniture, barrels, doors, or household items inside warmer workshops. Even school teachers adapted. Attendance frequently depended upon weather. Children living several miles away simply could not reach school safely after heavy storms. Learning continued whenever possible, but survival always came first. Toward late afternoon, the traveler entered another village, somewhat larger than the previous ones. Its meeting house stood prominently at the center. Nearby, several shops lined the main road. A cooper shaped wooden barrels beneath an open shed. A wheelwright repaired wagon wheels beside neatly stacked lengths of seasoned oak. Women carried baskets between stores, while children pulled sleds loaded with flour, firewood, and sacks of grain. Despite the cold, the village bustled with quiet determination. Life never stopped entirely during winter. It merely changed its pace. The traveler paused outside the general store. Several men stood gathered around a notice posted beside the entrance. As he approached, he discovered they were discussing not politics nor trade, but the weather, specifically rumors arriving from settlements farther north. According to recent travelers, temperatures had fallen to astonishing levels. Rivers frozen earlier than anyone remembered. Livestock lost despite careful shelter. Entire orchards damaged by relentless cold. One man quietly remarked that old apple trees sometimes split apart during especially severe freezes. The traveler had heard such stories before. Remarkably, they were true. When temperatures plunged low enough, moisture trapped inside living wood expanded as it froze. Branches occasionally cracked with explosive force. Entire trunks sometimes split open from top to bottom. People lying awake at night described hearing loud reports echoing through the forest like distant musket fire. Not hunters, not soldiers, simply trees surrendering to the cold. The discussion continued for several minutes. No one exaggerated dramatically. There was little need. Winter possessed enough power without embellishment. As evening shadows stretched once again across the snowy road, the traveler realized that these stories carried an important reminder. No matter how carefully people prepared, no matter how much firewood they stacked, no matter how wisely they stored food or strengthened roofs, there were still moments when nature reminded everyone that complete control remained forever beyond human reach. And in the weeks ahead, countless families across early America would discover that the greatest challenge of winter was not always surviving the storms. Sometimes it was surviving the silence that came after them. The deepest part of winter rarely announced itself with a single unforgettable day. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost unnoticed. One morning, someone realized the woodpile had grown much smaller than expected. Another afternoon, a mother counted only a few jars remaining on the cellar shelf. A farmer paused beside his barn and noticed that the hayloft, once packed tightly to the rafters during autumn, now contained more empty space than full. Nothing dramatic had happened. No disaster, no great storm, only the slow arithmetic of winter. One log at a time, one loaf at a time, one day at a time. For the traveler, the road had become strangely familiar. Each sunrise brought another village, another frozen creek, another chimney sending smoke into the pale sky. The people changed. The concerns did not. Everywhere he stopped, conversations circled back to the same subjects. How much longer? How much wood remained? Had anyone seen signs of an early spring? Were the geese returning yet? Did the river show any movement beneath the ice? Hope often arrived disguised as observation. Someone insisted they had heard more birds that morning. Another claimed the afternoons felt slightly brighter. An elderly widow smiled while pointing toward the southern side of her stone wall, where a narrow ribbon of dark earth had begun peeking through the snow. It was hardly larger than a blanket, yet neighbors came to look at it anyway. Winter taught people to celebrate very small victories. One afternoon, the traveler stopped beside a mill whose great wooden wheel stood perfectly still. The miller greeted him warmly, but with tired eyes. In summer, he explained, the water never stops. He pointed toward the frozen stream. Now the river sleeps. Without moving water, the heavy wheel could not turn. Without the wheel, grain could not be ground as quickly. Families sometimes waited days longer than expected for flour. The interruption affected everyone. One frozen stream could quietly reshape life across an entire valley. Not far beyond the mill, he encountered something that would remain in his memory for years. An elderly couple walked slowly along the road, pulling a small sled behind them. There was nothing unusual about the sled itself. No furniture, no firewood, no sacks of grain. Instead, neatly folded beneath a thick wool blanket, rested several fresh loaves of bread, jars of preserved vegetables, and bundles of split kindling. The traveler offered a polite greeting before asking where they were headed. The old man smiled gently. "Our neighbor took ill." He shrugged, as though no further explanation were necessary. "They have young children." That was all. No speeches, no praise, no expectation of reward. Simply neighbors helping neighbors. Because winter demanded that people look beyond their own doors. History often remembers the governors, soldiers, merchants, and explorers who shaped the young colonies. Yet countless winters were survived because ordinary people quietly carried bread through deep snow, because someone chopped wood for an aging widow, because strangers repaired broken wagons, because travelers shared news of safer river crossings, because families opened their homes to people they had never met before. The traveler realized that the true story of winter was not simply one of suffering. It was also one of generosity. The cold tested every community. Kindness allowed many of those communities to endure. Eventually, almost so gradually that few people noticed at first, change arrived. The mornings remained bitterly cold. The nights still demanded roaring fires. Yet daylight lingered just a little longer. The shadows no longer stretched quite so early across the fields. Crows became noisier. Woodpeckers tapped more frequently against old trees. One afternoon, while crossing a meadow, the traveler heard something he had not heard for many weeks. Running water, only a faint trickle. Somewhere beneath the snow, a tiny stream had begun moving again. Spring had not arrived. Not yet. Winter still possessed many cold mornings ahead. But the season had quietly begun surrendering. Farmers looked toward their fields with different eyes now, not wondering how long they must endure the snow, wondering what work awaited once it disappeared. Children searched eagerly for the first patches of muddy ground. Women inspected remaining seed stores. Men examined plows resting inside barns, already thinking about repairs before planting time. The entire colony seemed to inhale gently. Winter was loosening its grip. Looking back across the miles he had traveled, the traveler understood something he had not fully appreciated when his journey began. The greatest hardship had never been the snow itself, nor the frozen rivers, nor the endless chopping of wood. It had been uncertainty, never knowing whether supplies would last, whether illness would pass, whether another storm waited just beyond tomorrow. Yet generation after generation faced those uncertainties anyway. They built homes where forests had once stood. They planted orchards whose fruit they might never personally harvest. They raised children who would inherit stronger communities than the ones they themselves had found. Winter did not defeat them. It shaped them. It taught patience, preparation, humility, and perhaps most importantly, it taught that survival was rarely an individual achievement. It was something accomplished together. As evening settled over another quiet valley, smoke rose peacefully from dozens of chimneys, each one glowing softly against the fading blue of the winter sky. Families gathered around their fires, bread baked in iron ovens, stories passed from one generation to the next. Outside, snow still covered the fields, but somewhere beneath that silent white blanket, seeds waited patiently for warmer days. They had waded through every storm, every bitter wind, every frozen night, and just as they always had, they would rise again when the earth was ready. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey through the hardships and resilience of early American winters. I hope these stories helped you drift into a peaceful state of rest, while offering a glimpse into a world where every warm fire, every shared meal, and every act of kindness carried extraordinary meaning. Sleep well, and until our next journey through history, may your night be warm, peaceful, and wonderfully quiet.